It was 1750, and Adam Jacob Crotts gripped the ship's rail as the vessel lurched over another rolling wave. The sea had been restless for weeks, its endless motion turning the journey into a test of patience and endurance. Around him, fellow passengers muttered prayers or groaned, clutching their stomachs with the weary resignation of those who had long since given up on feeling steady. The air carried a mix of salt, damp wool, and the unmistakable scent of too many people packed into too small a space for far too long. Someone nearby let out a dramatic sigh. "Still better than paying taxes in Germany," another voice grumbled. Adam wasn't so sure. Anne Maria, his wife, sat behind him, cradling a small bundle wrapped in cloth, a pouch containing what little they had left of value. She had been strong throughout the journey, never once complaining about the cramped quarters or the dwindling rations. Like Adam, she knew they had no choice but to endure. They had left their home in Philipsburg, Germany, seeking a better life in America. In Germany, land was scarce, and heavy taxes crushed the poor. War was a constant threat, forcing young men into service under rulers who cared little for their suffering. But it was not only the burden of poverty and war that drove Adam Jacob Crotts to leave, it was faith. For generations, German Protestants had struggled under the rule of Catholic princes, enduring restrictions on worship, forced military service, and economic discrimination. The Palatinate region, where Adam's family lived, had been devastated by war and shifting rulers, each imposing new laws that dictated how they could practice their religion. Churches were taxed heavily, preachers were silenced, and in some cases families were forced to convert or leave. Adam had heard stories of Pennsylvania, a land where William Penn's vision of religious freedom had created a refuge for men like him, Lutherans, Reformed Christians, and Anabaptists who wanted only to worship in peace. There, no prince or bishop would dictate how a man prayed. A man willing to work could own land, build a home, and provide for his family without fear of persecution. It had sounded like a dream until they stepped aboard the ship. The voyage had tested them in ways they never imagined. Storms battered the ship, rats infested the lower decks, and sickness spread like wildfire. Some passengers never lived to see land again. But now, the dream was within reach. Ahead, the Delaware River stretched toward the horizon, leading to Philadelphia, the gateway to a new world. Adam caught his first glimpse of the city, a cluster of buildings rising from the shoreline, docks bustling with ships from every corner of the world. A deckhand shouted, "All passengers prepare to disembark." Excitement and fear warred within Adam. Would they be allowed to stay? Would they find work? Would they regret leaving everything behind? Anne Maria placed a hand on his arm. "We have come too far to turn back now," she said softly. Adam nodded. They had survived the ocean. Now they had to survive America. The moment they set foot on the docks, the reality of their situation became clear. Philadelphia was unlike anything they had ever seen. Loud, chaotic, and filled with people from every nation. Street vendors called out in English, German, and Dutch, selling bread, tools, and fabrics. Horses pulled heavy carts over cobblestone streets, and the salty breeze from the river mixed with the aroma of baking bread and manure. Adam and Anne Maria followed the line of immigrants toward a small wooden building where officials recorded their names. "Name?" the clerk asked in clipped English. "Adam Jacob Crotts," he answered in his thick German accent. The man frowned, dipping his quill into an inkwell. "Crotts?" Adam hesitated. "Crotts," he repeated, but the clerk had already scribbled something in his log. Anne Maria squeezed Adam's hand. They had heard this happened often, names altered, sometimes accidentally, sometimes to make them sound more English. If it helped them blend in, maybe it was for the best. After answering a few more questions, they were directed toward a crowded square, where workers sought laborers for farms and businesses. They needed work, they needed a place to stay, they needed a future. Philadelphia had opportunities, but land was expensive. German immigrants often traveled west to Lancaster County, where farms needed laborers. Adam found work there, earning enough to survive but not enough to buy his own land. Pennsylvania was welcoming to Germans, but it was not where Adam saw his future. By 1753, rumors spread that land was still plentiful in North Carolina. Many Germans had already moved south, settling in Rowan County, where the forests stretched for miles, untouched and waiting. It was a hard journey, weeks on foot, sleeping under the stars, trading labor for food along the way. They passed through Virginia, crossing rolling hills and muddy roads, until at last they reached North Carolina. Adam knew the moment he saw the land that this was home. Towering oak and pine trees lined the riverbanks. The soil was rich, dark, and unspoiled by over-farming. It would take years of backbreaking work to carve a farm from the wilderness, but it would be theirs, here. they could raise a family. Here, they could build a future. And so, beneath the shade of a towering oak, Adam Jacob Crotts took his first steps into a new life. He was now a landowner. His dream had come true. He wiped sweat from his brow and drove his axe into the thick trunk of an oak tree. The sound of splitting wood echoed through the clearing. Another tree down, dozens more to go. He spent 2 years carving this land from the wilderness. The dense forests of Rowan County, North Carolina, were both a gift and a curse, fertile soil for farming, but an endless battle against nature. With each tree felled, a field took shape. With each stone removed, a foundation was laid. His wife, Anne Maria, tended the small garden near their log cabin, growing beans, squash, and corn. She had learned from other settlers which crops thrived in North Carolina's hot summers and bitter winters. It was a hard life, but it was theirs. By 1753, their first child, Adam Jr., was born. Valentine Crotts followed in 1755. Their children would never know Germany. This land, this wild and unforgiving frontier, was their home. Survival in the wilderness. Life in Rowan County was not for the weak. Every day was a battle, against the elements, against wild animals, against hunger. Their cabin was built from hand-hewn logs, its roof covered in wooden shingles. The walls were chinked with clay and straw, sealing out the winter wind. Inside, a stone hearth provided heat and a place to cook. Food was never guaranteed. Hunting and farming were essential. Adam taught his sons how to trap rabbits, track deer, and fish in the nearby creeks. They learned early that a missed shot or a broken snare could mean hunger. Anne Maria made clothes from wool and linen, dyed with walnut husks or berries when they could spare the time. Everything they owned was made by hand or bartered for with neighbors. Winter was the true test. Without enough firewood or stored food, a family could freeze or starve before spring. Many settlers did not survive their first few years. But the Crotts family endured. By the time Adam Jr. and Valentine were young men, talk of war spread through Rowan County. It began as whispers in the taverns, grievances against the British Crown, anger over taxes, resentment toward King George. By 1775, war was no longer talk. It was real. Rowan County was divided. Some settlers, many of them Scots-Irish and English, remained loyal to Britain. Others, inspired by Patrick Henry and the Sons of Liberty, took up arms for the patriot cause. For Adam Jacob Crotts, the war was a dangerous distraction. His focus was on his farm, his family, and survival. There is no record of Valentine Crotts fighting in the war, but militias roamed the countryside, engaging in skirmishes with loyalist forces. The Battle of Ramseur's Mill, fought just west of their land in 1780, saw neighbor fighting neighbor. By the war's end in 1783, the British had lost, but North Carolina was left in ruins. Farms were burned, families torn apart, and lawlessness spread. Yet the Crotts family remained, plowing their fields, raising their children, and preparing for the next generation. The frontier was no longer the edge of the world. It was home. By the dawn of the 19th century, Valentine Crotts had taken his father's place, working the land that Adam Jacob Crotts had carved from the wilderness. When Valentine passed in 1800, his son, Valentine Jr., continued the family's tradition, planting, harvesting, and raising his own children in the same cabin his grandfather had built. The world was changing, but for the Crotts family, life remained simple, ruled by the rhythm of the seasons. By the time Elijah Crotts was born in 1821, North Carolina was no longer the wild frontier. The forests had given way to farms, dirt paths had become roads, and small towns had taken root where once only trees stood. But for families like the Crotts, life had not changed much. Elijah's world revolved around work. As a child, he learned to plow fields, mend fences, and harvest corn and wheat. He woke before dawn, carried water from the creek, and fed the animals before breakfast. There were no luxuries, no easy days. His father, Valentine Jr., taught him to hunt, not for sport, but for survival. A deer meant meat for the winter. A missed shot meant another night with nothing but cornbread and beans. On Sundays, the Crotts family attended church, a rare break from the endless labor. It was not just a place of worship, it was a time to meet neighbors, barter goods, and hear news from the world beyond their farm. Elijah grew into a strong, hard-working man. In 1840, he married Rachel Self, a woman as tough and determined as he was. Together, they built their own farm, much like the one he had been raised on. By the 1850s, America was changing. The North was industrializing, cities growing, factories rising. The South remained rural, dependent on farming and, for many, slavery. The Crotts family did not own slaves, not because of politics, but because they could not afford them. Their farm was worked by their own hands, not those of forced labor. But slavery was tearing the nation apart. Elijah heard the debates, at church, at the market, in the newspapers he occasionally read. Politicians in Washington argued over whether new states should allow slavery. The talk turned to secession, war, and bloodshed. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. By 1861, South Carolina seceded, and war was declared. At first it seemed far away. Men volunteered to fight, young men, eager for glory. They marched off, believing the war would be over in a few months. It was not. By 1862, the war had become a slaughter. Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg, battle after battle, thousands of men killed. Still, Elijah stayed home. He was too old to be drafted. His duty was to his farm, to his wife, to his children. Then the war took a turn. By the fall of 1863, the Confederacy was desperate. Losses at Gettysburg and Vicksburg had drained its armies. More men were needed. The government expanded conscription laws. Now, even older men had to fight. Elijah, at 42 years old, received his summons. His wife, pregnant with twins, begged him not to go. But the law gave no choice. On a cold autumn morning, Elijah kissed his children goodbye, packed what little he had, and left his farm behind. He would never return. Elijah Crotts arrived at Camp Holmes near Raleigh, a place that barely deserved to be called a training ground. It was little more than a collection of tents and wooden barracks, filled with men who had never expected to wear a uniform. The air smelled of sweat, gunpowder, and the lingering scent of desperation. Most of the recruits were like him, older men, but there were also boys barely old enough to grow a beard. The Confederacy had scraped the bottom of the barrel, pulling in anyone who could carry a rifle. The younger men who had enlisted in the first years of the war, those who were still alive, were now battle-hardened veterans. The drill instructors, veterans of battles in Virginia and Tennessee, wasted no time breaking the new men in. Elijah learned how to load and fire his musket quickly, how to march in formation, how to follow orders without hesitation. He had spent his life working a farm, but nothing could prepare him for the endless drills, the shouted commands, the blisters forming under his worn boots. Food was scarce, hardtack, salted pork, and whatever the quartermasters could scavenge. Some men fell sick before they ever saw a battlefield. A few deserted in the dead of night, slipping into the woods, choosing the risk of being hunted over the certainty of dying in some distant place for a cause that now seemed hopeless. Elijah stayed. Orders came in early summer. The 30th North Carolina Infantry was needed in Virginia, pulled from the defensive lines around Petersburg, where they had spent weeks under constant artillery fire from Union General Ulysses S. Grant's relentless campaign. The war had turned against the South. The days of grand victories were gone, replaced by exhaustion, hunger, and the grim certainty that every new battle could be their last. Elijah Crotts had already seen more fighting than he had ever imagined when he first reported for duty at Camp Holmes. His regiment had marched through Virginia, reinforcing Confederate lines wherever they were weakest, sent into battle after battle with little time to recover. At the Battle of the Wilderness, the first major clash of Grant's overland campaign, he had fought in the choking smoke of forest fires that burned men alive where they fell. He had barely slept in the trenches at Spotsylvania Courthouse, where the rain turned blood-soaked earth into mud, and hand-to-hand combat raged for hours at the infamous Bloody Angle. He had marched south toward Cold Harbor, where Confederate soldiers dug in behind earthworks, repelling Grant's doomed frontal assault, watching as wave after wave of Union troops fell under musket and cannon fire. Through it all, Elijah survived, but survival had come at a cost. By June 1864, the 30th North Carolina was a shadow of the regiment it had once been. The men were starving, their uniforms in tatters, their bodies worn thin from marching, fighting, and marching again. Some had seen so much death that they fought in a trance, no longer feeling fear, only exhaustion. Then came new orders. The Shenandoah Valley was under siege. Union General David Hunter had marched through Virginia, burning homes, barns, and entire towns, leaving destruction in his wake. When he reached Lexington, he torched the Virginia Military Institute, looted homes, and threatened to push deeper into the South. Confederate General Jubal Early was sent to stop him. His corps, including Elijah's regiment, was pulled from the trenches and sent north. The march was brutal. Blazing summer heat, little food, even less water. Dust coated their throats and sweat soaked through their worn uniforms. But there was no time to rest. Hunter was moving fast, and Early wanted to strike before the Union forces could regroup. The 30th North Carolina Infantry reached Lynchburg just in time. Hunter's men attacked, but Early's forces held the city. With their supply lines cut and Confederate reinforcements arriving, the Union Army retreated. The rebels pursued, pushing them out of the Shenandoah Valley, chasing them into West Virginia. But the fighting was not over. With Hunter defeated, Early turned his attention north to Washington, D.C. He wanted to strike deep into Union territory, forcing the North to pull troops away from Grant's siege of Petersburg. The Confederate Army moved swiftly, pushing into Maryland, defeating Union forces at the Battle of Monocacy in early July. The road to Washington lay open, but the Union capital was not undefended. By the time Early's men arrived, the city's forts were heavily reinforced. The Confederates launched an attack on Fort Stevens, but they were repelled. The dream of capturing Washington, D.C. slipped away. Outnumbered and running low on supplies, Early ordered a retreat back into Virginia. The Union Army followed close behind. By mid-July, the Confederates reached the Shenandoah River near a place called Cool Spring. Union forces under Colonel Joseph Thoburn were moving to cut them off. Elijah had survived the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, Lynchburg, and Monocacy. Now, Cool Spring would be his final battle. On July 17, 1864, Elijah Crotts crouched behind a fallen log, musket in hand, sweat dripping from his forehead. The air was thick with the sound of cicadas and the distant rumble of cannon fire. Across the Shenandoah River, blue-coated Union soldiers gathered, their bayonets catching the last light of the setting sun. The 30th North Carolina Infantry had been ordered to hold the river crossing at Island Ford. The Union Army under Colonel Joseph Thoburn was trying to push south, but Early's men stood in their way. The Confederates were outnumbered, but they held the high ground. Elijah had been in battle before, but something about this fight felt different. He was tired, not just in body, but in soul. The war had drained everything from him. But it was not over yet. "Hold your fire," an officer barked. "Let them come to us." The Union soldiers waded into the river. Water splashed around their legs as they struggled to keep their weapons dry. They were trying to flank the Confederates, hoping to push across before nightfall. The order came. "Fire!" A thunderous volley erupted from the Confederate line. Smoke filled the air, stinging Elijah's eyes. He fired his musket, barely registering whether he had hit anything before reaching for a new cartridge. Across the river, men fell. Some went under, lost in the current. Others scrambled back toward the shore. The Union attack faltered, but they did not retreat. They were regrouping, waiting for reinforcements. The sun dipped below the hills, casting the battlefield in darkness. Sporadic gunfire echoed through the trees. Elijah wiped his brow with a shaking hand. The real fight would come in the morning. Dawn broke over the valley, bathing the river in gold. The Union soldiers returned, this time in greater numbers. Elijah braced himself. The first wave hit hard. Musket fire erupted on both sides, bullets kicking up dirt and splintering wood. Elijah fired, reloaded, fired again. The smoke was so thick he could barely see. Cannon fire thundered from the hills behind them. Confederate artillery, perched on higher ground, rained shells down on the river. The Union troops pressed forward, slogging through waist-deep water, pushing toward the bank. The order came to counterattack. Elijah and his regiment surged forward, yelling as they charged. The air was filled with the sounds of battle, shouting, gunfire, the sharp clang of bayonets meeting steel. The Union flank wavered. Some soldiers turned and ran. Others stood their ground, fighting hand-to-hand in the mud and water. For a moment it seemed like the Confederates had the advantage. Then, fresh Union reinforcements arrived. The Confederate line began to break. Elijah heard the retreat order over the chaos. The 30th North Carolina fell back toward the trees, trying to regroup before they were surrounded. He turned to run. A sharp, burning pain tore through his chest. The world spun. His legs gave out. He collapsed to the ground, fingers grasping at the blood-soaked dirt. The sounds of battle faded into a dull roar. His thoughts drifted to Rachel, to the twins he would never meet, to the farm he had left behind. The sky above him blurred. The Shenandoah River, the trees, the battle, it all faded away. By nightfall, the Union forces had withdrawn, and the Confederates claimed victory. But for Elijah, the war was over. The letter arrived in late summer, carried by a neighbor who had just returned from town. Rachel Crotts saw the envelope and knew. She did not open it right away. Instead, she set it on the rough wooden table beside a half-mended shirt and a basket of beans waiting to be shelled. She stared at it as her children played outside, their laughter drifting through the open doorway. Finally, she picked it up. The handwriting was careful, almost hesitant. "Mrs. Crotts, I regret to inform you that your husband, Private Elijah Crotts of the 30th North Carolina Infantry, fell in battle on July 18th at Cool Spring, Virginia. He fought bravely. His sacrifice will not be forgotten. There was more, but Rachel did not read it. She did not need to. Elijah was gone. She sat for a long time, staring at the uneven floorboards, listening to the wind rustle the dry cornstalks outside. The war had taken so much from so many, fathers, husbands, sons. Now it had taken him. Rachel had no time for mourning. The twins were only months old. The older children still needed food, clothes, firewood for the coming winter. The farm did not care that her husband had died. The soil still needed tending. The cows still needed milking. The Confederacy was crumbling. By the spring of 1865, the war was lost. Soldiers, broken, starving, defeated, returned home. Some towns were burned. Others were just empty. North Carolina, like the rest of the South, lay in ruin. Rachel did what she had always done. She worked. She plowed the fields with calloused hands. She patched clothes until the fabric was more stitches than cloth. She taught her children to work beside her because there was no other way to survive. Her eldest sons, John Hardin, 16, and Edward, 14, took on the burden of keeping the farm running. John handled the plowing and planting, his back aching from long days in the fields, his hands blistered from gripping the plow. Edward tended the livestock, repaired fences, and chopped wood to keep the house warm through the winter. They had grown up fast, forced into the responsibilities of men long before their time. The twins, Elijah Lee and Rachel Elizabeth, never knew their father. They grew up hearing stories of him, of the man who had left his farm to fight and never came home. They learned his name, but they would never hear his voice, never know the warmth of his embrace. The war faded into history, but the Crotts family endured. Years passed. Edward married and started a family, welcoming his son Scott into the world in 1886. As his family grew, he made the difficult decision to leave North Carolina, moving west to Arkansas, where land was plentiful and new opportunities awaited. There, he built a new life, raising his children with the same hard work and resilience that had defined the Crotts family for generations. Scott grew up and in 1917 had a daughter named Clidith, who would one day journey even farther west, settling in California, where she would raise her own family. Though the Crotts name had traveled across states and generations, the legacy of perseverance, sacrifice, and survival remained unbroken, carried forward by those who came after. A descendant traced the lines with a fingertip, following the path back through generations. Elijah Crotts, born 1821, died 1864, Cool Spring, Virginia. His story had nearly been forgotten. A farmer turned soldier, a husband, a father, a man who had left his home because the war had called him, because duty had given him no choice. Before him, his father, and before that, his grandfather. Back through the years, through the forests of North Carolina, across the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, to a ship rocking on the waves in 1750, carrying Adam Jacob Crotts and his wife from Philipsburg, Germany, to a new land, a new life. They had all come seeking something: freedom, land, survival. They had endured hardship, war, and loss. They had built a life from nothing, carved homes out of the wilderness, tilled fields with their own hands. And now, centuries later, their descendants lived on. The world had changed, but the story remained. It was a story of perseverance, a story of sacrifice, a story that refused to be lost.